I've come out to Ware in Hertfordshire, just north of London, with Dave Binns and Gary from the Bermondsey Joyriders. And Dave's come to show us this mound, which is an Iron Age burial mound. It's sat in the middle of this housing estate. Most likely location for an Iron Age burial mound, but Dave says that's exactly what that patch of grass there is.
So what we got here, Dave, exactly?
We have got an Iron Age burial mound here, and as far as I can tell, and I'm pretty sure about this, there has been no archaeology on it. So who knows what is in there? I mean, there will certainly be bodies in there. There could well be pretty, refined, swords, ornamental stuff,
jewellery and this kind of thing, and pottery.
You probably know that. I mean, these were not for your average people. There wasn't a league. There was a social elite by this time, and these were. The assumption is that they were for either for whole privileged families or for key members of privileged families.
And I suppose a lot of people just take this for granted. Look, there's a great big mound there, and I mean, if you're in the process of building a new housing estate and you've got all the machinery, why not just have everything flat in the first place?
Well, this is important, you see, because there's an archaeological
and that gives it away a little bit, doesn't it?
There's something about the old mounds, and it's to do with the sweep of the curve.
Oh, I see.
You don't get the sudden fall-aways because they've actually been eroded. They've been levelled over time. I mean, we're talking about probably 2,500 years ago. I mean, that's when it was built, and it's survived as with this prominence, because it would have been a rather different shape. It would have been much taller, and it would have been much steeper as well. There are people around here, I suspect a small minority, but there are some people who know about this, though the prevailing story, as often with prehistoric sites, is, it's a Roman thing. That's what most people tend to assume, that anything that survives is Roman.
That's not correct, is it?
It's not correct, no. It would be interesting to know if there's any there may be Roman traces here, because in the Roman period there continued to be burials inside the old mounds. And as I say,
they utilised the...
Yes.
Oh, I see.
It didn't just come to an end, and there's not necessarily any direct connection.
A bit like the Christian Church using old pagan sites.
Yes.
That they would have been appropriated.
Yes.
Oh, gotcha. Right.
Yes, there was not necessarily any direct cultural connection between the people who built the mound and the people who later on may have continued using it.
Brilliant.
They may have had different cosmologies, they may have had different tribal structures, patterns and so on. They may have had different origins.
Dave, how did you find this burial mound? Okay. How did you get here?
See, I really began to develop an interest in a long time ago I went to Stonehenge. Little historical aside, autobiographical aside. I first went to Stonehenge. I hate Stonehenge, actually. I think it's a horrible place, a place of death. And I checked out a couple of obvious ones like that. I began to get more interested in it about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and as I was coming up to retirement then and beginning to just look around thinking, well, what am I going to do with the rest of my life, started walking more. I mean, I'd always been a walker, but so I was looking at Ordnance Survey maps which contain, most of the mounds that survived are indicated on them, one with a little sign. So I was just finding them, and I hit on one here. Basically, I was tracing the River Lea to see what I could find along it, because to see what is surviving. I had an intuition very early on that the River Lea has been far more important historically and prehistorically than is often credited. This is how I discovered it, basically. I found it on the relevant Ordnance Survey map. Most of my Ordnance Survey maps go back to 1959, actually. Not that I've had them since then, but they do. And I thought, right, this is interesting, but it's strange because it's in the middle of a housing estate, and you don't find many surviving prehistoric burial sites in the middle of a housing estate. So I came.
Yeah.
And after a bit of wandering back and forth, I found my way here. Then I contacted, I think it was Hertford or Hertfordshire Council, my letter and email found
Yeah,
its
you,
way
you,
to
you found somebody
an
who
archaeologist.
was quite sort of sympathetic to what you was talking about and more or less verified what you were saying.
Definitely.
So they documented it when they built the estate. Is that what was when? But it's not been excavated.
I don't think it has been excavated. There was no reference to it being excavated. If it had been excavated, there would unless stuff had got lost or been destroyed, there would be some trace of it.
This is not what you would normally associate with an Iron Age landscape. This is true urban archaeology. This is looking down into the river valley below the burial mound. Dave, what's the significance of this part of the site here?
Well, we're down now very close to the old Lea Valley, which actually is even older, the old Thames Valley, but that's another story for another time. But this is what became known as the Lea Valley, and you've got the new river now. You've got what remains of the Lea and the new river. And you've got a train passing as well. You've got a rail line. So we are down below the rise, the hill on which the mound was built. So the interesting thing about that, and just incidentally, we're under a flyover, as you can see, which is one section of the A10, which is the old Lammin Street.
And Lammin Street is a Roman road built on top of an old pre-existing trackway, like a Neolithic trackway.
That is it, and probably pre-Neolithic as well, Neolithic. Yeah, no one has the faintest idea how long those tracks go back, how far they go back. It's really impossible to say. So I think the significance is that the mound, and for all we know there may have been other mounds there may have been a cemetery, an Iron Age cemetery, but it was on elevated land and it was overlooking the Lea Valley. Now again, there are traces in names, there's another mound actually in a little, not that far away from here, but there are traces of a number of prehistoric sites along the Lea, and it suggests a deep importance for the Lea in prehistory. I mean, there is a Neolithic, there is a magnificent Neolithic earthworks at the source of the Lea in what's now Luton, in open land in Leagrave, in the middle of a kind of post-industrial estate with unbelievable traffic pollution and whatever. But the River Lea was clearly of massive importance, culturally speaking, and we just have these beautiful traces of it now. Some of it in names, some of it in actual phenomena, like the mound that we've been looking at. It wasn't built quite that way, as I think it's generally assumed. There's been massive subsidence on most of these mound structures, but it's still there, and it's a reminder of another time that people were constructing these structures around and in relation to the River Lea, which really means around and in relation to their cultural usage of the River Lea.
So is it like our Ganges in a way? It's like an Essex Ganges, a sacred river.
I think it's an important point, yeah. I hesitate to call it a sacred river because there may not have been quite the distinction between the cultural distinction between the sacred and the secular that there is in a culture like the one we're living in. But it would have, I would assume, it would have been the site of a lot of the same kind of practices that we associate with the river, like the Ganges or the Thames. We think of the swords thrown into the Thames. I have a deep suspicion that if people began exploring, if archaeologists began exploring the Lea itself, or the course of the original River Lea, not the channels that we have now, the original River Lea, they would also find a large number of ritual depositions, such as swords, in the Lea as in the Thames. It's just that they've been looking in the Thames and they haven't been looking here. See, this is the modern trackway, pathway, and it's steps. You've got steps, which leads from the River Valley. the old River Valley, up to the estate where the mound is, where the Iron Age mound is. And obviously this is modern, and in this form it was built as part of this estate. It was to give access to the estate, and it looks the same period, and I'm sure it is. But it could be that this is built over, or more or less built over, an earlier track which comes up. And mentioning track there, it brings back this question of the Ermine Street and the pre-Roman side of Ermine Street. So you had a trackway, possibly some kind of surfacing before the Roman period, but certainly a trackway which was incredibly important, and it covered a long distance. Now, one of the reasons, presumably, why very early settlements back into the Mesolithic, pre-Neolithic period, that is, the Mesolithic, why very early settlements, traces of very early settlements have been found here. Presumably, this is related to the fact that this is a key point where Ermine Street crosses the Lea. It did cross the Lea. So there would have either been a bridge structure or a fjord or whatever. There would have been a fort. There would have been a way to cross. So it was an ancient way, a venerable ancient way, which probably goes a long way back, crossing an important river. So we begin to have a context as to why people were living and working, presumably one way or another, here at such an early point in time. It's the crossing of the old Ermine Street and the Lea. A lot of the surviving structures are in this kind of... They're rarely at the highest point, but they're moving close to it. But they're overlooking an area, and there's one strong, I would suggest, working theory, if you like, that this is to do with displays of political power.
Okay.
So you may have an elite family,
Okay.
which is buried, or a number of related elite families buried in a particular mound or cluster of mounds.
So they're making a visual statement about what this is all about.
Yeah.
So everybody knows exactly where they're coming from, what they're about,
and
what they're capable of.
And it exercises a certain authority and power over the domain which it presides over, which it views over.
Okay.
And this as a symbolic statement of the power of this emerging elite. See, this elite, it appears, was coming out of the Neolithic. It's traditionally called the Neolithic Revolution, but you could just as easily call it the Neolithic Counter-Revolution, which I think it's fair to interpret, at least partly, as... Well, you know, it's associated with agriculture, with the domestication of plants, animals, on a scale that nothing like it had happened before. There was a transitional period of semi-domestication. What it allowed was a surplus to be produced.
I see.
A surplus of food, which could allow a division of labour to develop.
Yeah.
So when, a little bit later, new stages of ironwork began to appear, new processes like this.
That gives a sense of security to everybody that's involved in there.
Yeah, and because agricultural productivity has risen with the domestication of plants and animals, you can actually feed this population doing other things. You can also feed a ruling group, a power elite. So I look at this in terms of structures like this and the older ones like the Neolithic. What we're actually seeing is a kind of crystallization in the landscape, a physical crystallization, which is an expression of behaviour, people transforming the landscape. And what we're seeing is a crystallization of the emergence of class society.
Gotcha.
Or proto-class society.
I thought you was leading to that, but I wasn't going to interrupt you because it was sounding beautiful the way he was explaining it. And that's spot on there.
We have class society and the state, because you have dominant groups and individuals apparently regulating this process of constructing. Now, there may have been cooperative elements as well. There may have been, we don't really know. I doubt if it was all purely coercion with characters with whips driving people. But we have to ask seriously what it would take for people who, a very short period before, were gatherer hunters, and they were living that kind of life It can be idealised. I'm sure there were difficulties and difficult times of the year, the proverbial lean times. But the assumption is, in the archaeology and prehistory, that the Neolithic revolution or counter-revolution involved a massive intensification of disciplined work, back-breaking work. The archaeologists who've looked at the skeletons from this point of view see a deterioration in many respects. That, bones are being deformed. There might be evidence of
where more heavier manual work is now coming in the process.
And also more nutritional problems, because even though agricultural productivity was raised, massively raised, the range of foods that were eaten was narrowed. So it homed in on a number of plants, on a number of grains, on a smaller number of animals. People were not taking the hundreds of stuff. I mean, there was a period where they would still go out into the woods and whatever and get the wild stuff, but gradually it became you ate what you grew.
Okay.
We're talking about this is what is beautiful, the still visible crystallisation of the social and cultural and political emergence of class society and the state. All our problems.
Excellent, Dave.